Story number 1. The Christmas Card. Christmas 1977 was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, even. That's how I wanted it. After 5 years of living alone, I had learned to endure the silence, to find some semblance of comfort in the absence. My husband, John, had passed suddenly in 1972, leaving me with memories and an empty house. I thought I had made my peace with it, but I didn't know the past had a way of clawing its way back. I was living in our small house in a snowy suburb of Toronto, a place that always looked picturesque during the holidays. Wreaths hung on doors, lights twinkled in windows, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine. But inside my home, there was no festive cheer. I couldn't bring myself to decorate anymore. The thought of unpacking those old ornaments, things John and I had bought together, was too much. Instead, I spent my evenings curled up by the fireplace, reading or knitting, trying not to dwell on memories. It was December 22nd when the card arrived. I remember the exact moment because it was the only piece of mail I'd received that day. Plain envelope, slightly yellowed, with my name scrawled across the front in handwriting that stopped me cold. It was John's. I knew it immediately, that looping Y at the end of my name, the way he always pressed too hard with his pen, leaving indentations in the paper. My heart skipped a beat as I turned the envelope over. There was no return address. I opened it with trembling hands, my breath hitching as I slid the card out. It was a Christmas card, simple but familiar, a snow-covered cabin surrounded by evergreens, with Merry Christmas embossed in gold script. My stomach churned as I stared at it, the memory rushing back. John and I had bought this exact card together during our first Christmas as a married couple. We'd planned to send it to his parents, but for some reason, we never did. It had stayed in a box with the rest of his belongings after he died. The message inside was brief, written in John's unmistakable hand. "Merry Christmas, Mary. Don't forget me." I felt the blood drain from my face. The handwriting wasn't just similar, it was identical. Every loop, every curve, every quirk was his. My mind raced for explanations. A cruel prank? Someone who had access to his things? But no one had touched John's box since I'd packed it away in the attic years ago. I clutched the card tightly, my heart pounding as I glanced around the room, half expecting to see him standing there. That night, I tried to convince myself it was a mistake. Maybe I had written the card years ago and forgotten. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. Something about it felt wrong, too deliberate. The next morning, I went to the attic. The box of John's belongings was exactly where I had left it, tucked into a corner beneath an old quilt. My hands shook as I opened it, sifting through the contents: his watch, his favorite scarf, a few photographs. At the bottom was the stack of Christmas cards we'd bought together. I counted them. One was missing. I stared at the empty space in the stack, my stomach turning. It didn't make sense. I had never touched these cards after John died. How could one have been sent to me? I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the unease. But the house felt different, heavier. Shadows seemed longer, the air colder. Every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. By the time night fell, I was too afraid to sleep. I stayed in the living room, the card sitting on the coffee table, this presence unbearable yet impossible to ignore. That's when the noises started. It began as a faint tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the living room window. My heart raced as I turned my head slowly, half expecting to see John's face staring back at me. But the window was empty. The street beyond blanketed in snow, undisturbed. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the snow-covered yard and the faint glow of a neighbor's Christmas lights. But when I turned back toward the living room, the card was gone. I stood there, my breath catching in my throat, my mind scrambling for an explanation. I searched the room, my hands trembling as I moved cushions and checked beneath the furniture. Finally, I found it sitting upright on the mantel above the fireplace, propped neatly as though someone had placed it there. I hadn't moved it. The fear was suffocating now. I grabbed the card and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief, as though I'd rid myself of whatever dark presence had come into my home. But the relief didn't last. The next morning, the card was back. It sat on the coffee table, pristine and untouched, exactly as it had been when I first opened it. My hands shook as I picked it up, half expecting the message inside to have changed. But it was the same. Merry Christmas, Mary. Don't forget me. I couldn't stay in the house after that. I packed a bag and went to stay with my sister, leaving the card behind. But even at her house, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. At night, I heard faint whispers, indistinct but persistent, like someone calling my name from far away. My sister told me I was imagining things, that I was just stressed. But I knew the truth. When I returned to my house a week later, the card was gone. For a brief moment, I thought it was over, but as I entered the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the wall above the fireplace, written in ash, were the words, "I'm still here." I moved out of that house not long after, unable to bear the weight of its presence any longer. I never told anyone the full story, afraid they'd think I was losing my mind. But every Christmas since then, I've received a card in the mail. No return address, no postmark, just a simple message written in John's handwriting. "Merry Christmas, Mary. Don't forget me." I don't know what it means. I don't know if it's him, or something pretending to be him. All I know is that every year, the card arrives, and every year, the memories I've tried to bury come rushing back. Some people say love lasts forever, but they never tell you what happens when it refuses to let go. Story number 2. Krampus at my door. In December of 2015, I was living alone in a small village nestled in the Austrian Alps. The place was picturesque, like something out of a snow globe, with its quaint houses, snow-draped pine trees, and the distant sound of church bells echoing through the valley. It was the kind of village where traditions ran deep, and everyone grew up hearing tales of St. Nicholas and his sinister counterpart, Krampus. I never believed in the stories. Of course, Krampus was a relic of old folklore, a mythical figure used to scare children into behaving. But that winter, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. It was the night of December 5th, the traditional Krampusnacht, when locals donned elaborate goat-headed masks and paraded through the streets, cracking whips and rattling chains. I had always found the tradition fascinating, even amusing, but that year, I stayed home. A heavy snowfall had blanketed the village, and I preferred the warmth of my small wood stove to the biting cold outside. The evening passed uneventfully. I made myself a simple dinner, read for a while, and eventually settled into my armchair by the window, sipping mulled wine. The snow fell steadily, its soft glow illuminated by the streetlights. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual sounds of laughter and shouts from the parade were absent. That's when I noticed the footprints. First, they were just faint depressions in the snow, barely visible from my window. But as I peered closer, I realized they were unlike any footprints I'd ever seen. They were large, much larger than a human's, and the shape was unmistakable cloven hooves. A chill ran down my spine. The tracks started at the edge of the forest, about 50 meters from my house, and continued straight toward my front door. My stomach knotted as I traced the path with my eyes, noting the eerie precision of the steps. There were no other tracks, no sign of anyone or anything coming back out of the house, just a single, deliberate trail leading in. I tried to shake off the unease. Perhaps it was a prank. I told myself, kids from the village, trying to play on the old Krampus tales. But as much as I wanted to believe that, something about the tracks felt wrong. They were too deep, too deliberate. Whoever or whatever had made them was heavy, far heavier than a child. I locked the door and checked the windows, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the night was far from over. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise. First, I thought it was the wind rattling the shutters. But then I heard it again, a low, guttural growl, followed by the distinct sound of something scraping against the roof. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable jingle of bells. Not the cheerful chime of Christmas bells, but something deeper, more discordant. It sounded like chains being dragged across the roof, the metal clinking and scraping in a way that made my skin crawl. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and stood frozen in the center of the room, my ears tuned to every sound. The growling continued, punctuated by the occasional thud, as if something heavy was walking across the roof. Then, there was a loud bang, as if whatever was up there had jumped to the ground. The bells stopped. The growling stopped. The silence was deafening. I moved cautiously to the window, the poker still clutched tightly in my hand. The snow outside was pristine except for the trail of hoofprints, which now circled the house. My breath fogged up the glass as I scanned the yard, half expecting to see some hulking beast staring back at me. But the yard was empty. Then came the scratching. It started faintly, just a soft rasping sound against the wood of the front door. But it grew louder, more insistent, as if claws were raking across the surface. My blood ran cold. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide its presence. It wanted me to know it was there. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? That I was being stalked by a creature from a Christmas legend? They'd think I'd gone mad. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, stretching on for what felt like hours. I didn't dare move, my ears straining for any hint of noise. And then I heard it. A voice low, guttural, and impossibly deep, spoke a single word, drawn out and filled with menace. Naughty. I don't remember much of the rest of that night. At some point, I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the house was eerily still. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but then I saw the door. Deep gouges marred the wood. 5 long claw marks etched into the surface. My stomach turned as I ran outside to check the snow. The hoofprints were gone, as if they'd never been there. The only sign of what had happened was the damage to the door and the lingering, oppressive feeling that the house was no longer mine alone. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen or heard. Who would believe me? I fixed the door, scrubbed away the scratches, and tried to move on. But every December, as Krampusnacht approaches, I can't help but feel the same creeping dread I felt that night. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint jingle of bells, carried on the wind, and when the snow falls thick and heavy, I can't help but check for footprints. So far, I haven't seen them again, but I know he's still out there, watching, waiting, and every year, I wonder if I'll be naughty enough to see him again. Story number 3. The Spirit in the Christmas Tree. It was Christmas of 1932, a year of hardship and struggle for everyone, including my family. The Great Depression had left its mark on our small Midwestern town, but my parents were determined to keep the Christmas spirit alive, even if it meant making do with what little we had. That's why my father decided to cut down our Christmas tree himself from a nearby forest instead of buying one from the market. 10 years old, I thought it was an adventure, a story to tell my friends. I never imagined it would turn into the kind of story that haunts me to this day. My father and older brother, Jack, brought the tree home late one evening. It was tall and full, its branches lush with dark green needles. The perfect tree, my father declared, though something about it seemed odd to me. Maybe it was the way the branches hung, too still, as if they were holding their breath. Or perhaps it was the faint, musty smell that clung to it, different from the crisp, piney scent I'd expected. We placed the tree in the center of the living room, right next to the fireplace, and spent the evening decorating it with what few ornaments we had: handmade paper chains, a few fragile glass baubles, and candles carefully placed in metal holders. My mother stood back to admire it, her face glowing in the candlelight. "It's perfect," she said, though her voice lacked its usual cheer. That first night, the tree stood as a silent sentinel in our home, its flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced on the walls. It wasn't until we'd all gone to bed that the strangeness began. I was the first to notice it. Sometime in the dead of night, I awoke to the sound of whispering. First, I thought it was my parents talking in the next room, but the voices were too faint, too fragmented. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, slipping in and out of the darkness like a cold breeze. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. That's when I realized the whispers were coming from downstairs. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept out of bed, careful not to wake Jack, who was snoring softly in the next room. The house was cold, the kind of bone-deep chill that made my teeth chatter. As I descended the stairs, the whispers grew louder, not words exactly, but sounds, disjointed and eerie, like someone trying to speak through water. When I reached the bottom step, I froze. The whispers were coming from the Christmas tree. It stood there in the darkness, its candles extinguished, its ornaments catching the faint moonlight filtering through the window. The sound seemed to emanate from its very core, a low, mournful murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. I stared at it, my heart pounding, too afraid to move. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The whispers stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When nothing did, I forced myself to climb back upstairs, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I told my parents what I'd heard. My mother brushed it off as a bad dream, and my father laughed, ruffling my hair. "You've got quite the imagination, kiddo," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But that day, attention hung in the air. My mother seemed distracted, her eyes darting to the tree every so often. My brother teased me about my ghost story, but even he avoided getting too close to it. The dog, Scout, refused to go near it, his ears pinned back and his tail tucked between his legs whenever he was in the room. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. I stayed in bed, too terrified to investigate. I pulled the covers over my head and prayed for morning. But it wasn't the whispers that woke me the next night. It was my sister, Mary. Mary was 6, a bright-eyed, curious girl with a penchant for wandering. She came into my room that night, shaking me awake with a hand that felt ice-cold. "There's a lady by the tree," she whispered, her voice trembling. I sat up, my stomach twisting into knots. "What are you talking about?" "She's standing there," Mary said, tears welling in her eyes. "She's looking at me." Against my better judgment, I followed her downstairs. The living room was dark, save for the faint glow of the dying fire. At first, I didn't see anything. The tree stood silent, its ornaments motionless. But then I saw her. She was standing in the shadows, partially obscured by the branches. A woman, her figure pale and indistinct, dressed in a tattered white gown. Her hair was wild and matted, hanging over her face in tangled strands. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared at us with hollow, unseeing eyes. I grabbed Mary's hand and bolted back upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind us. We huddled together under the covers, too terrified to speak. The next morning, I told my parents everything. My father's face darkened, and my mother clutched her rosary, muttering a prayer under her breath. They decided to call the local pastor, Father Thomas, to bless the house. Father Thomas arrived that afternoon, a tall, solemn man with a kind but weary face. He listened intently as we recounted the events. nodding thoughtfully. "This tree," he said, his voice low. "Where did you get it?" My father explained how he'd cut it from the forest near Miller's Creek. At the mention of the location, Father Thomas's expression hardened. "That land," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "That land has a history. Decades ago, a young woman was murdered there. Her body was buried beneath one of the trees. Said her spirit lingers, unable to find peace." A heavy silence fell over the room. Father Thomas performed a blessing, sprinkling holy water on the tree and throughout the house. He prayed for the woman's soul, asking for her release. When he finished, he turned to my father. "The tree must go," he said firmly. "Burn it, and do not bring another into this house." My father didn't argue. That evening, we dragged the tree into the backyard and set it ablaze. The fire roared to life, consuming the branches and ornaments in an angry, crackling inferno. As the flames climbed higher, I thought I heard a final, mournful whisper carried on the wind. When it was over, the air felt lighter, the house no longer burdened by the weight of her presence. We never spoke of the incident again, but every Christmas after that, my father insisted on an artificial tree. He never explained why, and we never asked. Even now, decades later, I can still hear the faint sound of whispers in my dreams, and I wonder if her spirit ever truly found peace, or if she's still wandering that dark forest, searching for something she'll never find.